Please don't send me back.
The frost came in hard that January, the kind that settled into Eugene's bones before the city woke up and did not let go until well past noon. It turned the streets the color of old iron, glazed the sidewalks in a thin skin of black ice, and made the air taste like metal and exhaust and something else underneath, something older. The cold of a place that had stopped expecting warmth a long time ago. Weston Briggs did not notice the cold the way other people noticed it. He had grown up in it, in the poverty of Oregon winters, where the heat was unreliable, and the blankets were thin, and you learned early that discomfort was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be endured. He wore it now the way he wore most things, without complaint, without particular awareness, the way a man wears the weight of 15 years of careful not feeling. His garage sat at the far end of a crumbling lot on the east side of Eugene, wedged between a shuttered transmission shop and a chain-link fence that had been leaning at a 40-degree angle since a windstorm the previous October took it sideways. The garage was his in the way that things become yours when no one else wants them. The rent was low because the roof had a slow leak above the northwest corner, because the wiring was the kind of wiring that electricians looked at and then looked away from, and because the neighborhood had the silence of a place that had long since stopped expecting anything good to arrive. He lived in the back room, a cot against the south wall, a cast-iron wood stove he fed with split cedar when he remembered to buy it and with whatever was available when he did not, a shelf of motor oil and paperback novels with their spines cracked from being read in positions that books were not designed to survive, a camp stove with a single burner, and above the workbench, held to the wall with a single nail, one photograph. A boy of about 10 years old grinning at the camera with both front teeth missing, holding a socket wrench above his head, like a man who had just won something worth winning. The colors in the photograph had gone soft and yellowish at the edges, the way photographs do when they have been looked at too many times and not enough times simultaneously. Weston never looked at it directly. He had learned that the way you learn not to press on a bruise, not because it stopped hurting if you left it alone, but because pressing on it served no purpose except to remind you it was still there. He woke at 5:30 the way he always woke, not from an alarm, but from the texture of not being asleep anymore, the heaviness that settled into a man who had stopped expecting sleep to be restful. He pulled on jeans and a thermal and his work boots with the cracked left sole he kept meaning to replace. He put water on the camp stove and waited for it and made coffee and carried it to the garage door. He lifted the roll door at 5:47. He knew the exact minute because he looked at the clock on the workbench immediately afterward, the way your mind automatically marks the moment before it understands why it needs to be marked. The girl was sitting on his motorcycle, not beside it, not leaning against it. On it, both small hands wrapped around the handlebars, with the grip of someone holding the only solid thing available in a world that had stopped providing solid things. Her legs dangled bare feet, pale and red from the cold, the skin around her heels cracked and raw. She wore a thin gray t-shirt with a school fundraiser logo across the front, entirely insufficient for January in Oregon. Draped across her small shoulders was Weston's old club vest, the cutty he kept on the wall hook near the back of the garage, the one with the iron Hawks rocker across the back, and 11 years of road dirt ground into the leather so deep that no amount of cleaning had ever fully lifted it. She had gotten inside through the back window, the one with the broken latch he had been meaning to fix for 2 years. She had found the vest in the dark. She had climbed onto a Harley Sportster that weighed 430 pounds, and she had simply sat there, in the cold, in the dark, and waited. Weston stood in the doorway for what was probably 5 seconds, but felt considerably longer. The coffee mug was warm in his hand. Steam rose from it in a thin curl that the cold air took and dispersed immediately. The girl turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were brown, wide-set, framed by shadows that had no business being on a face that young. Her hair was tangled and half-dried as though she had been wet at some point in the night, and the cold had finished the job on it. There was a cut on her left forearm, shallow but real, the kind left by chain link or a broken window latch. Her feet were the color of candle wax where they were not red. She looked at him the way certain animals look at you when they are deciding what kind of danger you represent. Completely still, completely focused, reading everything available. Then she said it, "Please don't send me back." 4 words. They came out quiet and flat and without any of the theatrical quality that desperation sometimes produces in people. They came out the way a person states a fact they have been carrying so long it no longer requires emphasis to communicate its weight. Weston's hand tightened around the mug. Something moved in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. Not quite pain and not quite recognition, but somewhere in the territory between them. He did not say anything. He stepped fully into the garage and let the roll door settle behind him. He looked at her for a moment in the cold fluorescent light. She held his gaze without flinching. "How long have you been in here?" he said. "Since about 2 in the morning," she said. "Nearly 4 hours in January cold. The wood stove in the back room had been running, which would have pushed some warmth through the gap under the interior door, but still. 4 hours? In a garage? Alone? At 7 years old? You hungry?" he said. A pause. The question seemed to surprise her more than anything else could have. Like she had prepared herself for any number of responses, and that particular one was not among them. "Yeah," she said. He crossed to the workbench and set down his coffee. Then he walked to the interior door without waiting to see if she would follow. He heard the soft sound of her sliding off the motorcycle. He heard the quiet pad of bare feet on concrete. She followed him. The back room was small and warm from the stove, lit by a single overhead bulb, with a yellowed shade that gave everything the amber quality of an old photograph. Weston pulled a chair from against the wall and positioned it near the stove. She sat down. He opened the small refrigerator. Nearly empty the way it always was, but there were eggs and half a block of cheddar and the end of a loaf of bread. He made scrambled eggs in the cast iron pan without speaking. She watched him cook with the focused attention of someone for whom food had not always been a reliable or predictable thing. He set the plate in front of her, poured a glass of water, sat across from her with his coffee. She ate fast, not frantically, but with the controlled speed of someone trained by experience to eat quickly before the opportunity disappeared. "What's your name?" he said. "Nora," she said. "Last name?" "Keller. Nora Keller. How old are you?" 7. He looked at her. 7 years old, and she had navigated herself out of wherever she had come from in the middle of a January night, found a way into a locked garage, kept herself from freezing, and was now sitting here eating eggs with the composure of someone twice her age. "Where did you come from?" he said. A pause. She was measuring something, deciding how much to give the way people do when they have learned that information can be used against them. "Millbrook," she said finally. He knew the name. Millbrook Children's Home, a state-contracted residential facility about 4 miles east, a converted brick building that had once been an elementary school and now housed somewhere between 60 and 80 children at any given time, depending on the season and the particular churn of the foster and dependency system. "You ran away from Millbrook?" "Yes, in January, in the middle of the night, with no shoes." She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He said nothing. He waited. At night, Nora said they locked some of the rooms. She said it the way a person delivers a weather report. Even factual, requiring no particular emotional emphasis because the facts themselves were sufficient. Not the rooms where the older kids sleep. The small ones. The ones for the little kids, the ones who don't have anybody visiting. They lock them from the outside so they can't come out to use the bathroom. And in the morning, if something happened, they just change the sheets and act like nothing. The room was very quiet. "The food is different on inspection days," she continued. "Good food, real food. Other days it's whatever is cheapest. Some of the little kids, the really little ones, they're hungry all the time. You can hear them at night." Weston's jaw was tight. He was looking at the table. "The director," she said. "Mr. Holt. He doesn't hit anyone. He's smarter than that." She paused, choosing her words with the deliberateness of a child who had spent considerable time thinking about how to describe something that did not have simple words. "He looks at you like you're a problem, not a person, like you're something on a list that needs to be managed. And the staff that work nights, some of them follow what he shows them." She stopped. She had said what she was going to say for now. Weston could see the boundary of it in her face. "There's a boy named Marcus," she said. "He's 10. He fell off a bunk bed and his wrist was broken. He waited 2 days before anyone took him to a doctor." Weston did not say anything. "And a little girl named Clara. She was 4. She cried every night for 6 weeks. Then one morning she stopped and they moved her to a different wing and nobody would tell the other kids why. She said this last part with the same flat precision as everything else, not because she did not understand what it meant, but because she had learned that the way to be heard was to provide facts, not emotion. Emotion got you dismissed. Facts were harder to set aside. When she finished, the room held the silence of a space in which something heavy has just been set down. Weston stood up. He took her plate to the sink. He stood with his back to her, hands on the counter edge, looking at the faucet. He had a rule. He had constructed this rule with the care of a man who understood that without it he would come apart, and he had maintained it for 15 years with the discipline of a person who knows that certain doors once opened cannot be closed again. The rule was simple and absolute. Do not get involved, not in other people's pain, not in systems that could not be fixed, not in the grief of watching a child suffer at the hands of people who were supposed to protect them. Because getting involved meant feeling it, and feeling it meant Danny. He turned around. Nora was sitting with her hands folded in her lap watching him. She was not asking him for anything right now. She had already made her only ask. Don't send me back. Everything else was just waiting to see what kind of man he turned out to be. You can sleep on the cot, he said. I'll take the floor. Something moved in her face. Not quite relief because she was too careful for that, but a fractional easing, like a muscle that had been braced for impact slowly releasing. Okay, she said. The morning turned out to be considerably more complicated than that. Weston called Loretta Flynn at 7:45. Loretta was a lawyer who operated out of a cluttered office on Willamette Street and who had over the years done pro bono work for several members of the Ironhawks when the legal system had decided to make examples of them. She was 48 years old and possessed the composure of a person who had seen enough of the world that very little retained the power to surprise her. She arrived at 9 o'clock. She took in the scene without visible reaction. Weston, the garage, Nora sitting at the workbench drawing careful shapes in the margins of an old parts invoice with a stub of pencil she had found somewhere. Loretta pulled Weston outside into the cold lot. Talk, she said. He talked, short sentences, the facts only. Child in his garage barefoot escaped from Millbrook Children's Home account of locked rooms and inadequate food, and a director named Gerald Holt, who had been reported to DHS and whose reports had apparently vanished. He watched Loretta's face as he laid it out. Her expression stayed neutral, but her eyes sharpened with each detail the way a person's eyes sharpen when they are recognizing a shape they have seen before. She's a missing person right now, Loretta said when he finished. The moment they realize she's gone, if they haven't already, there's a report. Anyone who connects her to you is looking at harboring a runaway. I know. Weston, this is the system, the same system that already failed her. I know what system it is. What do you want to do? I want to keep her here until we know what she's actually going back to. You can't legally do that. I didn't ask you what I can legally do. Loretta put her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the frost-whitened ground for a moment. I need to make some calls, she said. There's a woman at DHS, Vera Stanton. She's been flagging Millbrook for 2 years and hitting walls every time. If we go through her instead of through standard intake, it buys us some time. How much time? Days? Maybe a week. That's too long if they're already looking. Yes, Loretta agreed. It is. She was quiet for a moment. Get her inside. Don't answer the door for anyone you don't know. She left. Weston went back inside. Nora had drawn a small bird in the margin of the invoice. Delicate, careful lines. She was looking at it with her head slightly tilted, the way people look at something they have made that has surprised them by being better than expected. Weston sat down across from her. You draw a lot, he said. When I can find something to draw with, she said. By noon, Nash Weaver had arrived with a supply box in a sleeping bag, rated to lower temperatures, and Dax Monroe had arrived behind him. Nash was 36 and compact and had the economy of movement of someone trained not to waste it. He had served 2 tours as a combat medic before deciding that the war had taken enough of him and that whatever was left needed to be used differently. He walked into the garage, looked at Nora, and did not make anything of it. He set down the supplies and looked at her directly and said, You need anything else in there besides eggs? Nora considered him. Do you have any oranges? Nash came back an hour later with oranges. Dax Monroe was 46 and built with the accumulated solidity of a man who had been hit a significant number of times over the years and had simply incorporated the damage into his overall structure. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the line of his jaw. He had been running the Iron Hawks for 11 years, which meant he had seen most of what a man in his position could expect to see, and very little of it had surprised him, and none of it had moved him to abandon what he understood to be his responsibilities. He came inside and assessed the room in approximately 2 seconds. Then he looked at Nora for about 3 seconds. Then he looked at Weston. He did not crouch down to talk to her. He did not soften his voice or adjust his posture to be less imposing. He just looked at her directly straight on, which was oddly more respectful than any deliberate softening would have been. "Your name is Nora," he said. "Yes. Tell me about Holt." She told him more than she had told Weston, details she had been holding back, calibrating, waiting to see if the room had earned it. She described a man in his middle 50s, clean-shaven, well-spoken, the kind of man who photographed well at charitable events. She described how the facility transformed in the 48 hours before an official inspection, how food improved, how locked doors became unlocked, how staff members who were normally absent or indifferent would appear and be attentive and patient in ways that disappeared completely the moment the inspectors left. She described Marcus again. She described Clara. And then she described something she had not told Weston, a detail she had held until she was sure it would be heard. She said that 6 months ago, she had watched a staff member on the night shift tell a 3-year-old boy who was crying that if he did not stop, he would be moved somewhere worse. She described the specific way the man had said it, the complete absence of any emotion in his voice, the way he had looked at the child, the way you look at a problem rather than a person. She said she had heard that same tone in Gerald Holt's voice every single time he had spoken to her. When she finished, the room was quiet. Dax looked at Weston. Something was moving in Weston's face that he was working to contain, a tightening around the eyes and jaw that Dax recognized because he had seen it before in the years he had known this man. "I'm calling Vera Stanton myself," Dax said, "and I'm calling Reed." Reed Holden was 44 years old and had spent a decade as a forensic accountant for an insurance company before he decided that the work required him to find information for purposes he found morally impossible to continue serving. He had left. He had kept the skills. In the context of the Iron Hawks, those skills were occasionally useful. "You'll be at the table tonight," Dax said to Weston. Weston nodded. He looked at Nora, who was listening from her place at the workbench with the alert stillness of a child who has learned that the information in rooms she is not supposed to be paying attention to is frequently the most important information available. "That okay with you?" Dax said to her. "Nash stays with you tonight." She looked at Nash, who was sitting near the door with his forearms on his knees, patient and entirely without demands on the room. "He brought oranges," she said. "He did," Dax agreed. "Okay," she said. Vera Stanton arrived that afternoon. She was 38 years old and had the eyes of a person who had been fighting a losing battle long enough that she had stopped expecting to win, but had not stopped fighting anyway. She sat with Nora for 40 minutes while Weston and Loretta waited in the cold lot. When she came out, her expression had the quality of someone who has just had a long-held suspicion confirmed in full. "What she's describing," Vera said, "is consistent with what I have been trying to document for 2 years. There is a pattern and Holt is the center of it, but he is insulated. Every time I get close, the paperwork reroutes to someone above me who buries it." "Who above you?" Loretta said. Vera looked at her for a moment. "The regional director has been in that position for 9 years. The person who appointed Holt in 2013 had a prior relationship with the regional director. Their connection runs through a county contracting structure that routes to Commissioner Ray Pruitt's district office." "Pruitt," Weston said. "I cannot say it directly," Vera said, "but the structure is there. It insulates Holt. It has for 2 years." She looked at Weston then, and the way she looked at him had changed from the way she had looked at him when she arrived. She was carrying something, and she was deciding whether to set it down here. "I looked up your name after Loretta called me this morning," she said. "There was a dependency case. A minor. Daniel Briggs, Medford Facility, 2009. Weston went very still. "The intake administrator on record at that facility during the relevant period," Vera said. She stopped, recalibrated. "Gerald Holt was appointed facility administrator at Millbrook in 2013. Before that, he spent 2 years in county contracting. Before that, he was the administrator at a residential facility in Medford. The cold in the lot was extraordinary. It had the quality of something that had no relationship to the conversation happening inside it and did not care. "I'm sorry," Vera said. The two words were insufficient. She knew it. She said them anyway because they were what was available. She walked to her car and drove away. Weston stood in the lot for a long time after she left. Loretta said his name once quietly. He did not answer. He was looking at the frost on the cracked asphalt, at the pattern the cold made in things, at nothing. Gerald Holt. For 15 years, the facility in Medford had existed in Weston's mind as an abstraction, a documented failure, an institutional indifference, a system that had not accounted for the life of a 9-year-old boy. It had no face, it had no name attached to it that carried weight. Just the system, the bureaucratic machinery of negligence, the cruelty of indifference at scale. Now it had a face. Now it had a name that he already knew. He turned and went back inside. Nora was at the workbench. She had finished the bird from earlier and started another one. This one with its wings fully extended, the lines careful and sure. She looked up when he came in and looked at his face with those dark circled eyes, reading everything the way she always did. He sat down across from her. He looked at the bird drawing without speaking. She was watching him, not demanding anything, not pressing, just present in the way that certain people are present without requiring anything from the room in return. "Danny was your brother," she said. It was not a question. Weston looked at her. She said, "You look at that picture the same way I used to look at pictures of my mom." He had not said Danny's name in this room. He had not pointed to the photograph or explained it to anyone. She had been in this space for approximately 12 hours and she had read the one thing he had not offered. He said, "Yeah, little brother." The word came out with the weight of something carried for a very long time by a single person and never set down. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She did not say she was sorry. She did not offer anything designed to reduce the weight of what he had just put on the table between them. She just held the information with him the way a person holds something fragile and important. "I was 14 when we got separated," Weston said. He said it with a directness that surprised him. He had not planned to say it. It was simply there waiting to be said, and for the first time in 15 years, the mechanism he used to prevent these things from being said was not operating. He was 6. I aged out of the system before he did. I tried to get legal custody. I was 20, no stable address, no income they would accept. They said no. She was very still. He stayed in 3 more facilities after that, Weston said. 3 years. And the last one I got a phone call one morning. He stopped. He had never said this out loud to another person. Not in 15 years. He had said around it and past it and about it, but never through it, never directly, never in plain language, without the insulation of institutional terminology or the protective distance of years. They found him on a Monday morning, he said. There were 2 staff on overnight for 17 kids. They said it was respiratory, but he was healthy. Before he went into that facility, he was healthy, and Holt was the administrator. The room held this. Nora said nothing for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "That's why you're doing this." Weston looked at her. "That's part of it," he said. "What's the other part?" He looked at her for a long moment. The small face, the eyes that had already seen too much and were still looking straight at the world without flinching. "You," he said. "Just you." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she turned back to her drawing and added one more line to the wing, careful and precise, and did not say anything else. That was all. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself as the moment that mattered most. But it was the moment 15 years of carefully maintained distance collapsed into something that was not grief exactly, but was what grief becomes when it is finally allowed to move. Weston picked up his phone. He called Dax. "Rain," he said when Dax picked up. "It's Holt." He was the administrator in Medford when Danny was there. A pause, the kind of silence that is not empty, but full. "Tell me everything," Dax said. Weston told him. When he finished, the line was quiet for 10 seconds, long enough to mean something. Then Dax said very quietly, "Table meeting tonight. Bring Reed. And Weston, we are going to need Loretta to move fast." Weston looked at Nora, who had fallen asleep at the workbench with her cheek resting on her arms, the bird drawing visible beneath her face, her breath slow and even in the yellow light. Yeah, he said softly. I'll be there. He hung up. Somewhere across Eugene, in a clean office with framed certificates on the wall and a family photograph on the desk, a man named Gerald Holt was conducting the ordinary business of his day, returning calls, reviewing schedules, presenting to the world the smooth and unremarkable surface of a professional man who had never done anything that could not be explained. He did not know that the wall had cracked. He did not know that in a garage on the east side of Eugene, a man who had spent 15 years carrying a weight without a name had just found the name. And a 7-year-old girl with steady hands and a habit of seeing things clearly had been the one to hand it to him. The table meeting at the Iron Hawks clubhouse began at 9 that night. The building was a converted machine shop off Chamber Street, the kind of place that looked forgotten from the outside and was clearly not forgotten once you understood what it was. The main room had a long table built from reclaimed fur, wide enough that it could not have been brought in through any of the doors, which was fitting because the table was not going anywhere. The walls held the accumulated objects of years, a framed section of chain-link photographs, a set of elk antlers that had been there longer than any current member could account for. 8 men sat at the table. Weston knew all of them in the shorthand of men who have been through things together without always finding words for what those things were. Dax laid it out. Not just Nora's account, the broader picture. Millbrook Children's Home and its director, the DHS contact Vera Stanton, and her 2 years of suppressed documentation. The financial structure, Reed had begun tracing that afternoon, a nonprofit management company called Steedford Children's Services, through which Millbrook's state contract flowed, and the connections between Steedford's board and Commissioner Ray Pruitt's district office, and Gerald Holt. The full shape of him, not just as Millbrook's director, but as the administrator who had been present in Medford in 2009 when a 9-year-old boy named Danny Briggs had died in a facility that had documented violations going back 18 months before the death. I want to be clear about what I am proposing, Dax said. He had the quality when he spoke in this room of someone who had measured every word before placing it. I am not proposing anything that puts any child in more danger than they are already in. I am not proposing anything that gives these people ammunition to bury what we are building. What I am proposing is that this club uses every legitimate resource it has to take this apart completely, legally, publicly, and permanently. Reed Holden spoke from his seat near the end of the table. The financial structure is there. Steedford connects to Pruitt's office through a contracting mechanism that has been in place for 6 years. There is no direct paper trail between Pruitt and Holt, but the design of it is unmistakable. This was not built by accident. This was built by a patient man who understood how systems work and used that understanding deliberately. Dax looked at Weston. Weston was sitting with his forearms flat on the table. His face had the quality of contain that everyone at the table understood meant the opposite of calm. She walked 4 miles in January with no shoes, Weston said. His voice was even. She had to run away from a place that was supposed to take care of her because staying was worse than freezing. I'm not asking any of you to feel what I feel about this. I'm asking you to help me make sure she doesn't go back there. And I'm asking you to help me make sure there is no Millbrook left to go back to when this is done. The room held it. A man named Gunner Cross, 34 years old and quiet, in the way that men who have seen the inside of jails are sometimes quiet, said, "When do we start?" "Tomorrow," Dax said. "Tonight we think, and nobody does anything that gives them a reason to come at us." It was in the language of this room a complete statement of commitment. Weston got back to the garage at midnight. Nash was asleep in the chair near the wood stove, chin to his chest. Nora was asleep on the cot in the sleeping bag, curled on her side, one small hand open on the pillow beside her face. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He thought about the rule he had built in the rain at a cemetery in southeast Eugene, standing over a box that was far too small for what it contained. The rule that had kept him functional for 15 years by keeping him separate from exactly this feeling. The weight of a child who needed something and was looking at him like he might be the one to provide it. He thought about Danny holding up the socket wrench. He took the rolled blanket from the storage shelf and lay down on the floor near the stove. He looked at the ceiling. The wood breathed outside. The frost kept settling on every surface it could find. He did not sleep for a long time. When he did, he dreamed about a door with a lock on the outside, and behind the door a sound he could not identify and the helplessness of a hand reaching for a handle that would not turn. He woke before 5. The stove had burned down to gray-white ash. The room was cooler. He fed it fresh wood and made coffee and stood at the workbench in the dark and thought about Gerald Holt waking up this morning in a clean house, making coffee in a clean kitchen, beginning another ordinary day inside the protection of a system he had spent 22 years carefully making sure would protect him. 15 years of grief without a face. Now it had one. He heard Nora shift on the cot. She sat up and looked at him across the warm room hair, flattened on one side, and did the thing she always did upon waking. Read the room before doing anything else, cataloging the available information before committing to any particular response to it. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I'm fine," he said. She looked at him the way she looked at things that were not quite true. She climbed off the cot and found her shoes, canvas sneakers entirely wrong for January, and stood in them looking at her feet. Weston was already at the camp stove making eggs. He made them without ceremony. She ate. He drank his coffee. "We're going somewhere today," he said. She looked up. The club. Dax's house. She peeled the last orange from the bag Nash had brought, doing it in a careful spiral, keeping the rind in one piece, a small, concentrated act of patience. "You already know they're going to help," she said, "or you wouldn't be taking me there." He held her gaze for a moment. She was right and she knew it, and she was not asking for confirmation, just observing. He nodded once. She ate the orange. He rinsed the dishes. He looked at the photograph on the shelf. Danny, 10 years old, wrenched, raised front teeth, gone grinning at whoever was behind the camera, with the complete unguarded happiness of a child who did not yet know what was coming. Weston looked at it directly, not sideways, not with the practiced avoidance of a man who has taught himself not to see something. Directly, the way you look at a thing you have stopped running from. He picked up his jacket. He said, "Let's go." The story ran at 6:14 in the morning. Weston knew the exact minute because he had been awake since 4, sitting at the workbench with cold coffee and the stillness of a man who has set something in motion and can no longer stop it and is not entirely sure he would if he could. He had watched his phone the way you watch a thing you have released into the world, with a mixture of certainty and dread that comes from knowing that what happens next is no longer entirely in your hands. The notification came first through Loretta's text. 3 words. "It is up." Then Dax. Then Nash. Then his phone stopped being a thing he was watching and became a thing that would not stop moving. He read Dana Ashton's piece standing at the workbench in the amber light of the single overhead bulb, while Nora slept on the cot behind him, her breathing slow and even, entirely unaware that the world outside the garage had just changed shape. Dana had written it with the precision of someone who understood that the most dangerous thing you can do to a protected man is simply describe him accurately. No reach, no editorial drama, just Millbrook Children's Home. Gerald Holt, director. The documented complaints filed with DHS over 24 months and the documented absence of any substantive response to those complaints. The financial architecture connecting the facility to Steedford Children's Services, and through Steedford to the county contracting apparatus and Commissioner Ray Pruitt, rendered in clean declarative sentences that landed like doors being kicked open in sequence, each one revealing another room that should not exist. Vera Stanton was named as a source, which meant she had decided to accept whatever professional consequence came with that decision. The 9-year-old boy, currently hospitalized with hypothermia and documented indicators of chronic nutritional deficiency, was unnamed but specific, and he was the center of the piece in the way that a single fact sometimes it becomes the center of everything impossible to manage or reroute or explain away. Weston set the phone down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. By 7, the piece had been shared 1,100 times. By 8, 2 television stations had called the Oregonian for comment. By 8:30, the commissioner's office had issued a statement calling the allegations serious and promising a full review, which was the language of a man buying time while making phone calls he did not want documented. By 9, Loretta called. "The hearing has been moved," she said, and he heard it in her voice before she finished. "Frank Riggs filed an emergency petition 40 minutes ago representing Steedford Children's Services. He is arguing that Nora is in the custody of an individual with a documented criminal record and known gang affiliation, and that every hour she remains constitutes ongoing endangerment," the EPO Weston said. "Judge Locke has not ruled yet. She is aware of the Ashton piece. But Riggs is arguing that the piece itself demonstrates that the Iron Hawks are using Nora as leverage for what he is calling a vigilante campaign, and that her welfare is secondary to their objectives. Loretta stopped for a moment. He is good, Weston. He is very good. When is the hearing? 2 this afternoon. You need to be there with Nora. And Weston, she needs to look like a child who is being taken care of. Warm clothes, clean, normal. I know what that means, he said. Nash took Nora to a second-hand shop on Willamette Street that opened at 9. Nora came back with a dark green wool sweater, proper winter boots, and a knit hat she had selected herself without asking anyone's opinion about it. She came back also with a drawing she had made on a paper bag in the car, while Nash drove a bird with its wings fully open that she had given to Nash without explanation, and that Nash had folded carefully and put in his jacket pocket without comment. Weston watched them come back into the garage. He watched Nora pull off the knit hat and look at it and put it back on. He watched her look at the boots with the attention of a child who had not owned adequately warm footwear in some time. She looked up and found him watching. You ready? He said. She said, have you been to court before? Yeah, were you scared? He thought about this honestly. No, he said. She nodded once, processing this information and filing it somewhere useful. Good, she said. Me neither. The courthouse was a gray stone building downtown that had the institutional weight of a place designed to make individual human beings feel small in relation to the processes occurring within it. Loretta met them on the steps at 1:45. She crouched slightly to look at Nora directly, not performing gentleness but communicating it through the directness of her attention. You do not have to say anything in there, Loretta said. The judge may ask you a question. If she does, answer it honestly. One sentence is fine. Do not explain. Do not try to convince anyone of anything. Just honest. Can you do that? Nora said yes. They went in. Frank Riggs was already at the opposing table. 51 years old, expensive suit, the well-maintained appearance of a man who had never needed to do anything in a hurry because the things he needed had always been arranged in advance. He looked at Weston once when they entered, a brief professional assessment. Then he looked away. The look was worse than contempt. It was indifference, Barnes. Weston was a variable to be managed, not a person to engage. Judge Maren Locke came in at 2:11. She was smaller than Weston had expected, compact and precise, with the manner of someone who had decided long ago that efficiency was a form of respect for other people's time. She looked at both tables. She looked at Nora, seated beside Loretta with her hands folded in her lap, in the green wool sweater, and the boots she had selected herself. The hearing ran 40 minutes. Riggs argued with the practiced fluency of a man who had delivered this argument many times in many forms. Weston Briggs had 2 prior arrests and 1 conviction for assault, served 18 months, released 7 years ago. He had no legal relationship to the child, no established residence adequate for a minor, no certification of any kind under child welfare standards. He was a member of an organization with a documented history of activities incompatible with the welfare of a dependent child. He was correct about every individual fact. Loretta argued Nora's own account of Millbrook. Vera Stanton's affidavit, 2 years of suppressed documentation now in the formal record. Dana Ashton's piece as corroborating context. She argued that returning the child to a facility currently under active journalistic scrutiny and a documented pattern of inadequate care constituted the more immediate harm. She argued 4 days of stable provision with no incident. She argued the child's own stated preference. Judge Locke looked at Nora. She asked her question directly without the softening that some judges applied to children in these situations, which Weston understood was deliberate. She was reading Nora, not performing for her. Do you want to go back to Millbrook Children's Home? Nora said no, 1 word, no elaboration, no performance. Locke looked at her for 3 seconds. Then she looked at her paperwork. Then she ruled. Temporary emergency protective order granted. Nora Keller to remain in the care of Weston Briggs under specified conditions. Weekly check-ins with an appointed DHS supervisor. Residence inspection within 48 hours. Monthly court review. Riggs's petition denied pending formal hearing scheduled 3 weeks out. Riggs stood immediately. Your Honor, with respect, motion denied, Mr. Riggs. We are adjourned. She left. Riggs gathered his materials with the controlled precision of a man who had lost a round and was already calculating the next one. As he passed the aisle where Weston stood, he did not look at Weston. He looked at Nora. A brief, flat, professional look, the look of a man assessing something he intended to return to on his own schedule. Weston stepped slightly between them, an instinctive movement, small but absolute. Riggs was already at the door. They were on the courthouse steps at 3:10 when Dax called. Weston answered and heard in Dax's voice the compression of a man who has received information that has changed the shape of everything and is working out how to carry it to someone it is going to hurt. Talk, Weston said. Reed found something, Dax said. In the Steedford financials, there is a secondary account structure payments routed through a consulting LLC that exists only on paper. Goes back 8 months. One of the names connected to the LLC has made 3 payments to a private investigator named Gary Solis. He paused. Weston. Gary Solis did background work for the club 4 years ago. He had access to our structure. He knew the garage. Weston went completely still on the courthouse steps. How long, he said. The most recent payment was 6 days ago, 3 days before Nora arrived. Weston stood with the cold coming in off the Willamette and worked through it. Solis was already watching before Nora. Someone had known for some time that Weston had been making quiet inquiries about the residential facility system in Lane County, asking questions through informal channels that left no paper trail, following up on the death of a man he knew whose son had passed through Millbrook 2 years earlier. Someone had decided those inquiries warranted monitoring before they became a problem. Someone who knew enough about Weston and the Ironhawks to hire someone with existing access. The LLC, Weston said. Any names? One Dax said. Reed pulled it from the filing, first name only in the communications he traced. But it comes up 3 times. The name is Earl. The world went briefly very quiet. Not the 9-year-old boy in the hospital. Weston understood that immediately and completely. That cold clarity of a mind that has just received a piece that completes a picture it did not know it was looking at. Earl Briggs, 42 years old. Weston's cousin, the only family member he had maintained any contact with over the past decade. The only person outside the Ironhawks who knew the East Side garage address. Who had been at 2 club gatherings in the past year. Who had access to the peripheral conversations, the kind of things said in parking lots after meetings, the kind of information that accumulates in proximity without anyone consciously offering it. Who had left a message 2 months ago asking how Weston was doing that Weston had not returned. Where is he? Weston said. He came to us, Dax said. He's at the clubhouse. He came in an hour ago and he is asking for you specifically. He says he has something. He says if you are not there in the next hour, 2 people are going to be hurt tonight. Loretta was watching Weston's face. Nora was beside her watching the same thing with those careful eyes. Weston said to Loretta, take her somewhere, not the garage. Somewhere Solis doesn't have. Loretta held his gaze for a moment. I have a place, she said. He looked at Nora. She was looking back at him with the composure she always brought to moments that required it. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue functioning in its presence. You will come back, she said. Not a question. Yeah, he said. I will come back. She held his eyes for 1 more second. Then she went with Loretta. Weston got on the Harley and rode. Earl Briggs was sitting on the floor of the Ironhawks clubhouse when Weston walked in. Not at the table, not in a chair on the floor, with his back against the wall and his knees up and both hands visible and open, the deliberate posture of a man communicating that he understood exactly what position he was in and was not attempting to obscure it. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled recently and dried in a thin, dark line down the side of his face. His jacket was open. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had crossed several points of no return in the preceding 24 hours and was sitting in the accumulated consequence of the decisions that had brought him here. 6 members of the Ironhawks were positioned around the room. Nash near the back wall, Gunner Cross at the front door, Reed at the table standing with his arms folded, Dax at the far end of the room, sitting, which was in the language of this space the most unsettling position of all, because it meant he had decided this required patience rather than force, and Dax's patience was a different thing entirely from his anger. Weston stopped in the center of the room. Earl looked up at him. I need you to hear me, Earl said. You have 2 minutes, Weston said. They have Vera Stanton, Earl said. The room shifted. Not physically, But the quality of the air changed the way air changes when everyone in a space has processed the same information simultaneously and is deciding what it requires of them. Weston said, "Say that again." Gary Solis Earls said, "He picked her up this afternoon about 2 hours ago. They are holding her at a property in the Glenwood industrial area, a warehouse that runs through one of Pruitt's LLC structures 3 layers removed from his name, but Reed can find it. I can give you the address." His voice was controlled. The control of a man who knows he has exactly this long to be useful before useful runs out. "They are not going to hurt her," Earl said, "if they get what they want." "What do they want?" Dax said from the end of the room. The investigation stopped. The Ashton piece retracted or buried. Nora returned to state custody before the EPO can be formalized. And the financial documentation Reed pulled, they know. He pulled it, they want it gone. "How do they know about Reed?" Weston said. Earl's jaw moved. He looked at the floor. "Because I told them 8 months ago," he said, "before I understood what they were actually running." The room was very quiet. "I knew they were paying me to watch the club," Earl said. "I told myself it was a property dispute. Pruitt has development interests in East Eugene. I thought the Saints were in the way of something real estate, something legitimate. I told myself that." He stopped. His voice had not broken, but it had changed register in a way that was worse than breaking. "I didn't know what Holt was. I didn't know what Millbrook was. Not until this morning. Not until I read what Dana Ashton wrote." He looked at Weston directly. "I have a daughter," Earl said. "She's 8 years old." Nobody said anything. "The address," Weston said. Earl gave it. Reed wrote it without looking up. "How many people?" Nash said. "Solis and 2 others. The 2 others are hired, not professionals. They will run if things get loud." "Is she hurt?" "She was conscious when they called me 40 minutes ago. That was the last contact I had." Weston looked at Dax. Dax looked back. In the 2 seconds of that exchange was a complete conversation about risk and legal exposure. In the absence of any version of this that did not carry significant cost, in the complete absence of any version of this that involved leaving Vera Stanton in a warehouse while they made measured procedural decisions. Dax stood. "Weston Nash me," he said. "The rest of you stay here with him." Earl started to rise. Weston said, "You've done enough." Earl sat back down. He looked at the floor. He looked like a man sitting in the ruins of a version of himself he had not known he was building until it collapsed. They moved. 3 bikes out of the lot onto Chambers Street, engines open in the cold dark of early evening, the sound of them rolling through Eugene's streets, carrying the weight of men moving towards something that needed to be done. The warehouse was in the Glenwood industrial pocket south of the river, a low concrete building in the kind of area that exists in every mid-sized American city as the residue of industries that packed up and left their shells behind. 2 vehicles parked outside, one window on the south face showing light through covered glass. They killed the engines 2 blocks out, pushed the bikes the rest of the way in silence. The city went about its ordinary business around them, oblivious. Traffic on the bridge a quarter-mile away. A train somewhere in the distance. The complete indifference of the ordinary world to the thing happening in this particular building. Weston assessed the exterior. Side door, south window. He looked at Dax. "We go in controlled," Dax said. Weston looked at him. "Controlled," he said. Dax held his gaze. 1 more second, then nodded. The side door was unlocked. Whether from carelessness or confidence, it amounted to the same problem for the people on the other side of it. Weston went through first. The interior was one large space poorly lit by 2 work lamps in the far corner, throwing yellow light and deep shadow in equal measure. It smelled of cold concrete and machine oil, and the staleness of a building that had been closed for a long time. Vera Stanton was in the far corner, seated, wrists secured to a metal chair, with zip ties, a strip of tape across her mouth that she had been working at because it was partially detached. She was not bleeding. She was looking at the door when they came through, and her expression moved through terror to recognition, to a composite that was not relief but was what came immediately before it. Gary Solis was standing 6 feet from her, and he was already turning. He was 50 years old and heavy, and had the physical confidence of a man whose work had usually gone his way. His hand moved toward his jacket. Nash was already across the space. What happened in the following 3 seconds was fast and final, and ended with Solis face down on the concrete, with Nash's knee in his back and one arm at an angle that made any further decision-making about resistance not worth the cost. The two hired men were at the far end of the warehouse. One had his hands up before anyone said anything. The other took approximately one additional second to evaluate the available information and arrived at the same conclusion. Weston crossed to Vera. He pulled the tape away from her mouth carefully. He took out his folding knife and cut the zip ties. Her wrists were red and deeply indented, but unbroken. She pulled her hands into her lap and looked at them for a moment, working the circulation back. "Are you hurt?" he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were fierce and exhausted and frightened and furious in the same register. "I'm not hurt," she said. Her voice was steady, which he could see cost her something. Then immediately, without pause, because she was exactly that kind of person, "They know about everything. Pruitt has been in contact with the regional DHS director. They are planning to terminate my employment tomorrow morning. Wrongful disclosure, unauthorized communication with outside parties. They are going to use my termination to attack the affidavit, discredit me as a fired employee with a grievance." Weston sat back on his heels. "It is coordinated," Vera said. "Holt Pruitt, the regional director. They have been working this since the Ashton piece ran this morning. The story did not panic them. It activated them." She looked at Weston directly. "They are going to move on Nora tonight, not through the courts. Through an emergency protective services order using my termination as the justification that the current arrangement is unsupervised. They have someone at DHS who will sign it." "Can they do that?" Weston said. "If they execute it before Judge Locke's order is formally processed in the system tomorrow morning, there is a window." She pressed her hands together. "It opens at midnight, 3 hours." Weston looked up at Dax. Dax's face was the face of a man watching a situation redefine itself in real time and recalculating with complete precision. "Where is Nora?" Dax said. "With Loretta." Weston said. "Safe location. I don't know the address. Call Loretta now." Weston called. It rang 4 times, then voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. The cold that moved through him then had no relationship to the temperature of the building. He called Loretta's office line. Nothing. Called her cell again. Nothing. Nash was watching him from across the space. "When did you last?" Nash said. 2 hours ago, Weston said. "She texted me when they arrived at the location." He looked at Dax. 2 hours ago. And Vera is telling him they plan to move tonight. They knew about the 3-hour window. They have someone inside DHS. And they already knew where Loretta lived because Salas had 8 months of access to everything adjacent to this club. Dax put his hand on Weston's shoulder. "One solid contact. Call Nash's contact," Dax said. "Iris, she knows Loretta," Weston called. Iris picked up on the second ring, and in the 3 syllables of her greeting, he heard it, the careful, worried quality of someone who already knew something was wrong and had been waiting for this call. "Iris," he said. "Loretta, where are they?" A pause that lasted less than 2 seconds but contained everything. "Loretta called me 45 minutes ago," Iris said. "She said someone was at the door of the house. She said she was going to check and call me back." Weston's hand around the phone was the only tight thing in him. Everything else had gone, the stillness of a man who has moved past fear into the territory where the only available currency is action. He looked at Dax. He did not need to say what he was thinking, because Dax was already thinking it. "Where did Loretta take her?" Dax said. Quiet, direct. "I don't know," Weston said. And those 3 words in his voice were the sound of the worst version of the next 3 hours opening up beneath him. Vera Stanton was already on her feet with her phone in her hands, wrists still red from the zip ties, working her contacts list. "There is one person," she said, "below the regional director. She has been clean the entire time I have known her. She has never been part of this." "Call her," Dax said. Vera called. Weston walked to the center of the warehouse floor. He stood very still. The work lamps threw his shadow long across the concrete, a distorted version of his shape. He thought about Nora on the courthouse steps. "You will come back." Not a question. He thought about the 3-hour window. Midnight. He looked at his watch. 9:47, 2 hours and 13 minutes. He thought about Gerald Holt somewhere in Eugene right now. In a clean house or a careful office, a patient man, a man who had built something durable across 22 years because he understood that systems protect the people who understand how to use them, and that the people outside the system always ran out of time before they ran out of patience. Holt had been counting on running out their time. He had miscalculated one variable. He had not accounted for the quality of a man who had carried a weight for 15 years without a name for it and had now found the name, and had a 7-year-old girl with steady hands who had chosen him before he had the chance to choose otherwise. Vera came back across the floor. Her voice was controlled. "There is an emergency DHS order in the system," she said. "It was filed 18 minutes ago. The executing party is a contracted transport agent, not a DHS employee heading to an address in the Friendly Street neighborhood." She paused. "The address belongs to Loretta's sister." Weston was already walking to the door. 45 minutes, Dax said behind him. "If we move now," Weston was already outside. He threw his leg over the Sportster. The engine caught on the first try, loud and clean, and certain in the dark. Dax pulled up beside him. In the amber of a distant streetlight, his face was iron. "We do this right," Dax said. "One last time." The same words. Weston looked at him. "We do this completely," Weston said. "We finish it." He pulled out. The Harleys moved through Eugene's evening streets, 3 engines, the sound of them rolling through the ordinary world that continued on all sides, indifferent, unaware. Traffic lights, a gas station lit up in the dark, the amber of sodium street lights on wet pavement. Weston rode point and did not think. He was past thinking. He was in the state of a man for whom every variable has been reduced to a single requirement, and the requirement is forward, and everything else is noise. The Friendly Street neighborhood was quiet old houses on a tree-lined block, the kind of street where the houses pressed close and the bare January trees arched over the road. The porch light of Loretta's sister's house was on. One upstairs window showed light. The street was empty except for a dark sedan parked 2 houses down that did not belong. Weston killed the engine a block and a half out. Dax and Nash went silent behind him. The sedan had contractor plates, a private transport service of the kind used when official vehicles invited too much attention. Weston looked at it for 2 seconds, then looked at Dax. Dax nodded once. They moved fast and without sound. Weston went to the front door. He knocked 3 times, stopped, then 2 more. A pattern he and Loretta had established years ago in a different context and had never used until this exact moment. He heard movement inside, then Loretta's voice close to the door. "Weston." "Yeah." The door opened. Loretta was standing in the hallway with her phone in her hand, and the expression of a person who has been frightened and has decided to stop being frightened and is managing the space between those 2 states. Behind her at the end of the hallway, Nora was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed over her chest, green wool sweater boots she had selected herself. She saw Weston. Something in her face released. Small, controlled, but completely visible. "There is someone at the back," Loretta said quietly. "He came 20 minutes ago. Said he was DHS. I did not open it." "He is not DHS," Weston said. He looked at Nash. Nash moved around the outside of the house. Weston heard the brief sounds of a physical exchange from the back of the house. One raised voice cut short. The sound of someone being redirected with finality. Then Nash's voice saying something low. Then quiet. The contracted transport agent, Ovia, was 23 years old and had been told he was executing a standard emergency welfare check. He was not hurt. He was finished. Weston came through the kitchen. The young man was sitting on the back steps with his hands on his knees, looking at the frozen yard. Weston stood in the doorway and looked at him. "Go home," Weston said. The young man went. Weston turned back inside. Nora was standing at the kitchen table watching him. She looked at his face the way she always looked at his face, reading everything available, cataloging, making the assessments that a child makes when she has learned that the accurate reading of adult faces is a survival skill. He crossed the kitchen and crouched down to her level. "You okay?" he said. She considered this question with the care it deserved. "Now I am," she said. He nodded. He stood back up. Loretta was already on the phone. She had made the call to the FBI field office. Not the local field office with its existing relationships inside the county structure. The regional office. She had the documentation ready. Reed's financial findings. Vera's affidavit. Donna Ashton's published piece. The documented kidnapping of a DHS employee earlier that evening. Gary Solis in a warehouse in Glenwood with 2 hired men. It was a package too complete and too public to sit overnight without action. Weston stood at the kitchen window and looked at the dark yard, the frozen grass, the bare branches of the backyard trees catching the light from the kitchen window. He thought about Danny. He thought about the photograph on the shelf in the garage, the missing front teeth, and the socket wrench raised like a trophy, the soft yellowed colors at the edges of a thing that had been held and not held simultaneously for a very long time. He thought about Holt's office somewhere in Eugene, the clean desk, the framed certifications, the family photograph, the smooth surface of a man who had spent 22 years making sure the surface was smooth. 2 hours and 13 minutes had been more than enough. Behind him, Nora climbed onto a kitchen chair and sat with her hands folded on the table, patient and entirely present, waiting for whatever came next with the composure of a child who had decided a long time ago that composure was the only reliable tool she owned. Loretta finished her call. She set the phone down and looked at Weston. "They are moving," she said. He turned from the window. "Yeah," he said. He looked at Nora. She was looking back at him. Whatever she saw in his face in that moment, she held without flinching, the way she held everything with the steady, undemanding patience of someone who had learned that the most reliable thing in an unreliable world was her own capacity to remain present inside it. The night pressed in from all sides. Eugene continued its ordinary business beyond the walls, the traffic, in the lights, in the complete indifference of a city going about its evening. And somewhere across town, in clean offices and careful houses, the machinery of a system that had protected Gerald Holt for 22 years was beginning to encounter something it had not been built to withstand. Not lawyers, not journalists, not DHS employees with 2 years of suppressed documentation. A man who had run out of every reason not to finish this. And a girl who had chosen him before he knew he was being chosen. Ray Pruitt was arrested at his home at 11:50 that night. Weston was sitting in Loretta's sister's kitchen with cold coffee when his phone lit up with a message from Dax. 4 words: "Pruitt is in custody." He set the phone down on the kitchen table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the window above the sink, at the dark yard beyond it, at the frost forming on the glass, in the particular slow way frost forms when the temperature has made its final decision for the night. Gerald Holt was taken at 12:32 in the morning from a hotel in Springfield, a mid-range property off Gateway Street, where he had apparently been since early afternoon. Not running. The reservation had been made under a Steedford Children's Services corporate account, which meant it was documented and traceable, and spoke to the psychology of a man who had never genuinely believed the system would stop protecting him. He had checked in and ordered room service and waited for the situation to resolve itself the way situations had always resolved themselves across 22 years of careful management. It did not resolve itself. When federal agents entered the room, they found a laptop and 2 external hard drives on the desk beside an untouched plate of food. Holt was sitting in the chair nearest the window with his jacket on, as though he had been about to leave for some time and had not yet managed to do it. He did not say anything when they came in. He looked at the agents and then looked at the window and then looked at his hands, and whatever he was looking for in any of those places he did not appear to find. The contents of the 2 hard drives would take federal investigators 8 weeks to fully catalog. The catalog, when complete, ran to 312 pages. 4 facilities across Oregon and southern Washington over 22 years. A pattern of intake manipulation that ensured the most vulnerable children, those without active family involvement, without advocates, without anyone checking regularly on their specific well-being, were placed in conditions that prioritize cost reduction over care. A network of staff, not many, but enough who understood what was expected of them and performed accordingly. A layered system of documentation management that could produce clean inspection records, while the actual conditions those records were supposed to reflect bore no relationship to what children inside those facilities were experiencing on ordinary days when no one was observing. Gerald Holt had not made a mistake and been caught. Gerald Holt had built something. He had built it with patience and intelligence and a thorough understanding of how child welfare systems created opportunities for exactly this kind of sustained exploitation, and he had run it for 22 years because the system he had built inside the system had worked. Until a 7-year-old girl with no shoes decided that a garage with a broken window latch was safer than where she had come from. Millbrook Children's Home was placed under emergency federal oversight at 6 in the morning. Staff were suspended. An independent team came in before breakfast. The children inside woke to a different quality of morning without fully understanding why. The food was different. The doors were different. The way the adults in the building moved and spoke and looked at them was different. They did not have language for what had changed, but they felt it the way children feel the difference between a place that is managing them and a place that is present with them. The 9-year-old boy from the hospital was named Caleb. He was discharged 4 days later. He had no family in the state. He had no one on record as an emergency contact who had responded to any of the 3 attempts to reach them. He had a stuffed bear he had carried into the hospital that was missing one eye, and he had the watchfulness of a child who has learned to read exits. Nash Weaver drove him to the temporary placement. Vera Stanton had arranged personally a licensed foster family in Cottage Grove who had been approved and waiting for a placement for 7 months. A couple in their 50s, a retired high school teacher, and a man who ran a small engine repair shop, who had a runs and a room with a window that faced a backyard with an oak tree in it. Nash walked Caleb to the door and introduced him to the family and watched the boy look at the dog and then look at the room and then look at the oak tree through the window with the careful attention of a child taking inventory of a new situation, checking whether it was the kind of situation that would hold. Nash drove back to Eugene alone. He parked outside the Iron Hawks clubhouse and sat in the truck with the engine off for 14 minutes. He did not tell anyone about those 14 minutes. Nobody asked. Some things are handled in the privacy of a parked truck on a cold morning, and the people who understand why do not require explanation. Marcus, the 10-year-old boy with the broken wrist who had waited 2 days for a doctor, was placed with a foster family in Corvallis. Gunner Cross drove him there on a Saturday 3 weeks after Millbrook was shut down, and on the way they stopped at a diner and Gunner ordered pancakes for both of them without asking, and Marcus ate 2 full plates and did not say much, and Gunner did not require him to. Clara, the 4-year-old girl who had cried for 6 weeks and then stopped, was placed with a family in Eugene itself, which meant she would be close. Vera Stanton checked on her personally every 2 weeks for the first 3 months. Nora asked about Marcus and Clara the week after the arrest in the same flat tone she used for everything important, not demanding information, but making clear that the information mattered to her. Weston told her what he knew. She listened and nodded once and went back to her drawing. That evening, she made 2 drawings, one of a boy standing in front of a house with a door that was open, and one of a small girl in a yard with a tree in it. She left them on the workbench without comment. Weston put them on the shelf. Frank Riggs lost his law license 8 months later. He moved out of Eugene before the investigation concluded. The regional DHS director resigned before the week was out and was later named as a cooperating witness in the federal case against Pruitt. Commissioner Ray Pruitt was indicted on 11 counts. Reed Holden assembled 8 years of county contracting records into a timeline so precise and comprehensive that the prosecuting attorney later said it was the most useful piece of forensic accounting work she had encountered in 14 years of federal prosecution. Pruitt was convicted on 7 counts. He was sentenced to 9 years. Gerald Holt was convicted on 11. Vera Stanton kept her job. Not because the system that had been working against her for 2 years suddenly corrected itself, but because the public attention generated by Dana Ashton's piece and the subsequent federal investigation made her removal politically impossible. She continued doing the work she had always been doing. She got better at protecting herself while doing it. She and Weston had coffee twice a month at a diner on Willamette Street. They talked about children, specific children, names and ages and current placements and how they were doing and what they needed. It was the most useful conversation Weston knew how to have. Dana Ashton received a Press Association Award for the Millbrook series. She accepted it briefly and without ceremony and returned to her desk the same afternoon. Earl Briggs left Eugene 3 weeks after the arrests. Before he left, he came to the garage on the east side. He came in the morning early, which told Weston something about the nature of the visit. Earl knew Weston's schedule. He knew that early morning at the garage was the time before the day began, the time that belonged to nobody in particular. Weston was at the workbench with coffee when he heard the knock at the side door. He opened it. Earl was standing in the cold in a canvas work coat that had belonged to their uncle. He looked smaller than Weston remembered. Not physically, in some other dimension that had no precise name. Earl said, "I'm not here to ask for anything." Weston looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly, more an absence of refusal. Earl came in. He stood near the door and looked at the garage, the workbench, the tools, the photograph on the shelf above the stove. He looked at the photograph for a moment with an expression Weston could not entirely read. I didn't know about Danny, Earl said. I need you to know that. When they hired me, when I started reporting back to Solace, I did not know the connection. I didn't know Holt was connected to Medford. I didn't know what I was protecting. He stopped. When I found out, he said, when I read the piece and started understanding what I had been part of, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a gas station for 2 hours. He looked at his hands. I just sat there. Weston said nothing. I know that doesn't change anything, Earl said. I know sorry is not a word that reaches what this is. I know there is no version of this where I come out of it as something other than what I was. I just needed to say it to you directly. The garage was very quiet. The wood stove breathed. The single overhead bulb cast its amber light across the workbench and the tools and the two men standing in the geography of something that could not be repaired, only acknowledged. Weston looked at his cousin for a long moment. Then he said, Danny deserved better than what he got. So did that little girl. So did every kid in those buildings. Earl held his gaze. That's all Weston said. Earl nodded once. He looked at the photograph on the shelf one more time. Then he turned and went out the side door. Weston listened to the sound of his car start and pull away down the crumbling lot and onto the street and diminish into the ordinary sounds of Eugene going about its morning. He stood at the workbench with his coffee going cold in his hand. He did not feel the thing he had expected to feel when Earl left. He felt instead the weight of something that had been completed. Not resolved, not made right, completed. The difference between those things was not small, but it was real, and he had learned enough in the past weeks to understand that completed was what was available, and that available was not nothing. He set down his coffee and went to the interior door. Nora was in the back room at the small table they had set up near the window drawing. She had been awake before him, which was becoming a pattern in the early waking of a child whose body was still calibrating to the experience of sleeping in a safe place and was not yet entirely sure how to respond to the absence of the things it had been braced against. She looked up when he came in. Was that Earl, she said. Yeah, is he gone? He's gone. She looked at him for a moment with those reading eyes. Then she went back to her drawing. He stood in the doorway and watched her work. She was drawing the garage from the outside the way it looked from the crumbling lot, the roll door slightly up, light coming out from underneath it in the early morning dark. She had it right. The lean of the chain-link fence at the property edge. The angle of the sign above the door that had lost 2 of its mounting bolts and settled into a permanent slight tilt. She had the light right the amber of the fluorescence coming under the door and touching the frost-whitened asphalt. He did not say anything about the drawing. He went to the camp stove and made eggs. The back room had changed since January. The wall between the storage area and the main living space had come down at the hands of a group of men who were not professional carpenters and whose work reflected this in certain minor respects and was nonetheless completely adequate in the respects that mattered. The space was larger now, properly insulated with a wood stove that worked reliably and a window that faced east. There was a bed with a proper frame, a desk that Nash had found at an estate sale and carried up the stairs of his apartment building alone, rather than ask for help with it, a shelf that currently held 11 drawings in various states of completion. The padlock on the kitchen cabinet was gone. He had removed it the second day. He had not replaced it. He had not said anything about removing it. Nora had opened the cabinet on the third day. She had stood in front of it for a moment looking at its contents. Then she had closed it and gone back to what she was doing. She had opened it every day since without any particular ceremony. She had never asked for permission, and he had never offered it, and the absence of that exchange was itself the entire point. They ate breakfast at the small table. She ate the eggs and half an orange. He drank coffee. The east window let in the early light, thin and provisional in January, but present, doing what it could. Vera Stanton called on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the arrests. She called with her usual directness, no preamble. I need to tell you something about the Medford facility, she said. Weston was at the workbench. He set down the socket wrench he was holding. I have been going through the documentation from Holt's Drive, she said. The full record. There is a section covering the Medford facility, the period from 2008 through 2011. He did not say anything. Holt was not present on the night Danny was found, she said. His overnight log shows he was in Portland at a conference. She paused. The staff member on duty that night was a man named Curtis Vane. Vane had been hired by Holt 14 months earlier, despite a prior incident report from a different facility that should have prevented his hiring. Holt had signed off on the hire personally. When the incident at Medford was investigated internally, Holt reviewed the case and submitted a finding of no procedural violation. He submitted that finding 3 times across 3 separate reviews over the following 18 months. Curtis Vane remained employed in the child welfare system until 2013. She stopped. Holt did not do what happened to Danny, she said, but he created the conditions that made it possible. He hired the person, he protected the person, he signed the paper that said nothing wrong had happened 3 times. Weston was looking at the workbench, at the socket wrench, at the way the morning light from the side window fell across the metal surface of the tools. For 15 years, he had carried the weight of Danny's death as a shapeless thing, an institutional failure, a system that had not accounted for a 9-year-old boy. Abstract, distributed, belonging to no specific location, now it had a complete shape. A man had hired a person he should not have hired. That same man had then protected that person 3 times in writing with his signature on the document. The death of a 9-year-old boy in January 2010 existed in a direct line from those decisions, not as an abstraction, as a consequence, a specific consequence of specific choices made by a specific person who had spent the following 13 years continuing to make the same category of choices in different facilities under different conditions, until a 7-year-old girl climbed out of a window and walked 4 miles in the dark. "Thank you," Weston said. He meant it completely and without any of the social lubrication that usually accompanied it. "Of course," Vera said. He heard her hesitate for a moment before hanging up. "I'm glad she found you," Vera said. Then she ended the call. He sat at the workbench for a while after that. Not a long time. Long enough. Then he heard Nora come through the interior door from the back room and stop. He turned. She was standing in the doorway looking at him with those reading eyes, doing what she always did, taking inventory of the room and the person in it, checking the available information against what she had anticipated. She said, "Are you okay?" He looked at her. 7 years old in the weeks after January. She had gained 6 pounds since the first morning, which the doctor at the pediatric clinic on Chambers Street had noted with the satisfaction of a person who tracks children's weight gain in the context of food security, the way other people track more ordinary numbers. She was taller too, or seemed taller, which might have been the weight or might have been the other thing, the less measurable thing, the way a person's posture changes when they stop bracing for impact. He said, "Yeah, I'm okay." She held his gaze for a moment with that assessing attention. Then she nodded, accepting the answer, and came through into the garage and climbed onto the stool at the far end of the workbench, where she had taken to sitting in the mornings when he was working, not talking, not requiring anything, just present in the way she was present, which was the fullest kind. She had her sketchbook. She opened it to a blank page and started drawing. He watched her for a moment, the focus she brought to the work, the way she held the pencil, not the way children are taught to hold pencils in school, but her own way, practical, efficient, producing the results she wanted. Then he turned back to the Harley he had been working on and picked up the socket wrench and continued. The garage was warm. The light through the side window was the light of Oregon moving through winter thin still, but carrying the first suggestion of what was coming, the way certain mornings begin to hold something that had not been present the morning before. 3 months after the arrest, Loretta filed the final adoption paperwork. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, the kind of afternoon that could not quite decide whether it was still winter or had become spring and had settled into a tentative gray that contained both possibilities. Eugene looked like a city reconsidering its commitments. The trees along Willamette Street were showing the first suggestion of green at the tips of the branches. Not yet leaves, just the preliminary intention of leaves. The world making its early announcement of what was coming. Judge Marin Locke's courtroom was smaller than the one where the emergency hearing had taken place. A family courtroom rather than a civil courtroom, with a different quality to it, a different scale, the intimate procedural architecture of a space designed for the kinds of decisions that do not benefit from grandeur. Weston sat at the respondent table in a button-down shirt he had bought specifically for this occasion and would never wear again, and knew he would never wear again at the time of purchase, and had bought anyway because some occasions require that a man make a specific effort with his appearance, not for anyone else's benefit, but as an acknowledgement of the weight of what is happening. Nora sat beside him in the green wool sweater she had chosen herself in January. Her hair was in a braid that Loretta had helped with that morning. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her expression, the composed attentiveness she brought to situations she had decided deserved her full presence. Loretta sat on Weston's other side with the paperwork in a folder in front of her, and the expression of a woman who had done this work for enough years to understand that the moments that looked like endings were always actually beginnings, and who found that she did not grow less moved by them with repetition. Judge Locke reviewed the documentation with the efficient precision she brought to everything. She looked at Nora, she looked at Weston, she looked at the paperwork again. Then she looked at Nora directly. "Nora Keller," she said, "is this what you want?" Nora said yes. Then she stopped. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked back at Judge Locke with the directness that was simply her way of being in the world. "I chose him the first morning," she said, "when he made eggs and didn't ask too many questions." The courtroom was very quiet. Loretta beside Weston made a small sound that she converted immediately into the clearing of her throat. Judge Locke looked at Weston. He was looking at Nora. He was looking at her the way he had looked at Danny's photograph on the morning he stopped running from it. Directly. Without the protective mechanism. Without the distance he had maintained for 15 years as a survival strategy and had not needed since the morning a 7-year-old girl had sat on his Harley in the dark and told him without knowing she was telling him that the thing he had been carrying could be put down now. Not abandoned, not forgotten. Put down and carried differently, which was the only form of relief that was real. He had known in the moment Nora said it the thing she was telling him. She had not been rescued. She had made a choice. In the cold dark of a January garage at 2 in the morning, with no one to advise her and nothing to recommend the decision except whatever she had read in a man who kept motor oil on a shelf next to paperback novels and a photograph he never looked at directly, she had made a choice. She had climbed onto his motorcycle and put on his vest and waited for him to open the door. Everything after that had been the consequence of her choice. He had spent 15 years believing that Danny's death was the thing that had defined him, the wall he could not get past, the weight that had no addressable location. And it was those things. He was not wrong about any of it, but it was not the whole shape. The whole shape was this. A man who had not been able to protect his brother had spent 15 years making sure he would never be in a position to fail someone that way again. He had built the rule around himself like a wall, and he had lived inside the wall, and the wall had held. And then a girl had walked through it like it was not there, because for her it was not there, because she had seen something in him that the wall was not actually covering, had always been visible to anyone looking directly, which most people were not, which she was because she had learned that accurate seeing was a survival skill, and she was very good at it. Judge Locke signed the order. She looked at them both over the edge of the paperwork and permitted herself a small thing, not quite a smile, but occupying the same space. A smile would occupy the expression of a person who has spent a significant portion of a career inside the machinery of systems that fail people, and who is in this moment watching the thing those systems exist to produce actually occur. "You are done here," she said. "Go home." Home by then was the garage on the east side, but changed. The east-facing window in Nora's room was only let in the morning light before the rest of the building received it, which meant that on clear days she woke to a room already lit with the gold of early sun, and on overcast days she woke to the diffuse, even gray that Oregon does better than anywhere else, a light with no hard edges that made everything look like it was waiting quietly for something. The shelf on her wall held 14 drawings, now some in pencil, some in the black pen. Nash had given her 2 in watercolor from the set that had appeared on her desk one morning, without explanation from a direction Weston declined to specify. The drawings had evolved since January. The birds were still there. They were always there. But they shared the shelf now with other things. The garage from the outside, the Iron Hawks clubhouse as seen from across Chambers Street, Dax Monroe's hands on a coffee mug, just the hands rendered with the attention she gave to things she found interesting. Nash asleep in the chair by the wood stove, chin to chest, arm folded, caught in the exact posture he had been in the night Weston had come back from the table meeting, to find him keeping watch. She had drawn Weston once from behind, standing at the workbench in the early morning, with his coffee, looking at nothing in particular. She had not shown it to him. It was on the wall with the others, and he had seen it, and he had not said anything about it, because some things communicate themselves adequately without words, and adding words would only make them smaller. Danny's photograph was on the shelf in the main room, face up the way Weston had placed it the night everything changed. He looked at it now without the sideways avoidance, without the protective mechanism of 15 years. Just looked. The missing front teeth and the socket wrench and the grin that had not known yet what was coming. The looking did not stop hurting. But it had changed character in a way that was significant. Pain, when it is finally given a proper address, becomes something different from pain that has no location. It becomes something you can carry with you rather than something that carries you. He had not been able to save Danny. He had known this for 15 years. He had known it intellectually, had reached it himself in certain dark early mornings, when the wood stove was low and the garage was cold, and the weight of things became briefly too heavy to avoid. He had known it and had not been able to stop the knowing from sitting in him like an accusation rather than a fact. He knew it differently now. Not because the knowing had changed, because the carrying of it had changed, because he was no longer carrying it alone in a room with a rule that kept everything else at a distance. Gunnar Cross had started visiting Caleb on Saturday mornings, driving to Cottage Grove and picking him up and bringing him to Eugene for a youth program Vera Stanton had helped connect him to. On the third Saturday, Caleb had stood in the garage doorway and looked at the Harley for a long time without saying anything. Gunnar had asked him if he wanted to see how the engine worked. Caleb had said yes. Nobody had formally decided this would continue. It simply continued. On the fourth Saturday, Nora was in the garage when Caleb arrived. She looked at him. He looked at her. She showed him the drawing she had made of the garage from outside. He looked at it for a while and then said, "You got the sign right. It tilts like that." "Yeah," she said. "It does." That was the beginning of that. The Saturday after the adoption was finalized, Weston came out of the back room at 8 in the morning to find Nora standing at the garage door in her coat and her good boots with a sketchbook under her arm waiting. He looked at her. She looked at the Harley. She looked at him. She looked at the workbench where the small helmet had been sitting for 3 weeks, bought without announcement, and left in plain sight without explanation. She said, "You bought that helmet before I even asked." He said, "I was thinking ahead." She considered this for a moment with the gravity she brought to things that turned out to matter. She picked up the helmet, turned it over in her hands, examining it with the care she gave to things that were hers. Then she put it on and buckled the strap and looked at him with the straightforward attention that was simply her way of being in the world. "Ready," she said. He pulled on his jacket. He started the Sportster. She climbed on behind him, small hands gripping the back of his jacket at his sides, and he felt the weight of her there, real and present, and entirely without the guarded quality it had carried in January, a weight that trusted the thing it was holding on to. He pulled out of the garage and into the April morning. Eugene in spring was a different city than Eugene in January. The same streets, the same buildings, the same chain link in asphalt, and the lean of the old structures that had been there long enough to take on the angle of things that have survived without being maintained. But different in the way that a place is different when the light changes and the cold lifts, and the world's annual insistence on continuing asserts itself in the green of trees coming back, and the smell of wet ground and the quality of air that has stopped being something to get through and started being something to be inside of. He rode. She held on. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying, which was its own form of arrival. The quiet of two people who have been through something together and are now on the other side of it, not because the something is gone, but because they have found a way to carry it that leaves the hands free. They rode south on Willamette, and then east on Franklin, and then out along the river road where the cottonwoods were fully leafed and the river was high from the spring runoff, and the light came through the canopy in the way it comes through cottonwood leaves broken into moving pieces, constantly changing the kind of light that makes the world look like it is alive in its own right and is not particularly concerned with whether you are watching. Danny's photograph was back at the garage on the shelf where Weston had placed it face up, catching the light from the east window. The drawing Nora had made of the garage from outside was on her wall, and the one of Weston at the workbench and all the others. The lock on the kitchen cabinet was still gone and was never going back. The Iron Hawks were scattered across Eugene doing the ordinary things of ordinary Saturday mornings. Nash at the farmer's market on 8th Avenue. Reed at his kitchen table with coffee and a stack of numbers he was working through for the satisfaction of the work. Dax on his porch with Hisden in the stillness of a man who had learned that stillness was not the absence of something, but the presence of everything arranged properly. Weston rode and Nora held on, and the river kept its own pace beside them. Indifferent and constant and entirely itself, which was all a river was required to be. He had spent 15 years in the geography of a man who has decided that distance is the only reliable protection. Distance from pain and distance from connection and distance from the risk of caring about something that could be taken away. He had maintained that distance with the discipline of someone who understood that it was costing him something and had decided the cost was necessary. He understood now that the cost had been exactly what he had paid and had produced exactly what he had been trying to prevent. Not the protection of anything, just the absence. The absence was over. He did not know all of what came next. The road ahead had the quality of a road before you are on it, the details not yet present requiring presence to become real. He knew some things. He knew the east window in the morning and the smell of cedar from the stove and the sketchbook open on the workbench and the sound of a pencil working carefully across paper in the quiet of a garage in the early morning when the day has not yet made its demands. He knew the weight of small hands on the back of his jacket, trusting the thing they were holding on to. He knew Danny's photograph on the shelf, face up the grin, with the missing teeth, the socket wrench raised like a prize. Not evidence of loss, not a wound that would not close. A fact about a boy who had lived and been loved and deserved more than he received, and whose memory was carried now differently with company in a room that was warm. The cottonwoods moved above them as they rode. The river ran beside them, high and cold, and entirely without concern for anything except its own direction. The April light came through the leaves in pieces and landed on the road ahead of them, moving and constant, simultaneously the way light behaves when it is alive. Weston rode. Nora held on. The road opened up ahead of them, and the morning continued in the direction. Mornings go forward without asking permission, which was the only direction available, and had always been enough.